Hi everyone, I am going to walk you through the edTPA Task 1 for the final module in this class. There are no required or embedded participation activities. The participation in this module will really be assessed in your final project. It will become very obvious who took the time to watch this video based on what you submit for your final project. So it's really important that you spend a lot of time on this. I would say give it one good listen before you start working on your project, and then return to the video, pausing and restarting as you're working on your final project. And then beyond our class, as you start to work on your real edTPA in the fall in your student teaching placement, you can use this video as a resource. So without further ado, I will dive in. Slide 2 of this presentation will be where I put the video that I'm currently recording, so you will see that when you enter the slides. So in this module, I will be first introducing you to the elementary edTPA Task 1. I will also explain what the rest of the edTPA looks like and why we're focusing just on Task 1 in this class. We'll go over some really important resources for you that you should use. We will talk about exactly what gets submitted for this class for Task 1. And for Task 1 of the real edTPA, we'll talk about how to actually complete Task 1. I will show you sample work, and I'm actually going to walk you through how to score a Task 1 of the edTPA, a sample, a full sample that I've provided, because I think that going through the scoring process is really the only way that you can deeply understand what it is you have to do for the edTPA. So that's how I've developed this module. And then we're going to end by talking about your Inch 390 final project. You are not submitting a whole entire edTPA. You are just doing Task 1, and I will show you exactly what you're submitting, how you're being graded, what it should look like in your folder, all of the different files you need to create. So that's where we are headed in this class. I'm actually going to scroll down and jump ahead to show you on slide 37. If you have any questions that arise as you're listening to this video or as you're working on your project for this class, I created a Padlet for you. It doesn't embed into a Google slide, so you'll have to actually click on the link and go out to the Padlet. But here is a Padlet for any questions that you have. You can post them anonymously. I've got it set to alert me when there are questions, so I'll pop back in and answer them. So I just wanted to point that out right away. It is at the end of the slides here, and I will make sure it's posted to our Moodle page as well. So let's get started. In this workshop, I'm really focusing just on Task 1 of the edTPA, but in this quick little intro to the edTPA, I'm going to talk about it all, what you actually have to submit. So what is the edTPA? It stands for the Educational, ed, Teacher Performance Assessment. And essentially, it's a standardized certification exam that teachers have to take in lots of different places in the United States, and it is meant to assess your ability to plan, to teach, and to assess. That right off the bat should make you feel pretty good because all of you can do those three things. This map shows the 22 states that require the edTPA for teacher certification right now. New York State was one of the first to hop on to adopting it in 2014. This assessment is meant to capture your teaching ability, quote, in action, unlike the traditional cert exam, which the rest of them are seated exams that you take at a computer, multiple choice or short response or essays. This is totally different. This is a portfolio assessment that you will be submitting and someone will be grading. The cost is $300. This is the most expensive cert exam, but you're very lucky here at Nazareth. That cost is actually embedded in the student teaching course fees that you pay. So your edTPA $300 is paid for. And how that works is when you take your student teaching class, you'll actually get a little code that you enter when it comes time to submit your edTPA to Pearson, which is where you submit your edTPA. It's an online platform. You'll enter that code and the fee will be waived. What is not covered in your course fees is if you have to retake the edTPA because you do not pass. But I don't want to focus on that. Just know that you don't have to come up with those $300 during student teaching. It is paid for. So, what do you have to do? There are various tasks that you have to complete for the edTPA, and this typically is going to involve a task in planning instruction, a task in teaching with videos that you have to submit, and a task in assessing. That's the general edTPA requirement for all teachers. In elementary education, there's actually one more requirement. Lucky you all. You have to submit a fourth task for math instruction, and it's basically a version of this. So for the elementary edTPA, you will submit a planning task, task 1 for literacy, an instruction task where you take a video of yourself teaching and submit that for task 2, and assessment. You will collect some assessment data from your class of students during student teaching. You will analyze that student learning. You'll give them feedback. You'll provide evidence that they can use your feedback. And that is task 3. You will also have a math task that will do all 3 of these things in one mini task for math. So that's what you will be submitting during your student teaching. The focus of this class is task 1, literacy, which is the foundation for all of the other tasks. You teach for the video the lessons that you planned in task 1, and your assessment is the assessment instrument that you designed for task 1. You actually give it to your students, collect the data, and analyze. So task 1 really is the foundational, most important task. If you've got a solid task 1, your chances of passing tasks 2 and 3 are much greater. That's why I've chosen task 1 as the focus of this 390 class. The handbook is your guide. You should read it, you should understand it, you should know it. So this is the first resource that you should all access. Now, something you need to know about this is the edTPA handbook for elementary education. You should all take the literacy with math. They also have one that's math with literacy. Here at Nazareth, all of our teacher candidates take literacy with math. And right now we're operating on version 7.1. Roughly every other year, they come out with a new handbook. It is your responsibility during your student teaching to make sure that you have the most updated handbook for the year that you are student teaching. So for this year, all of our candidates who student taught in fall of 2019 or spring of 2020 used this version. Next year, we might have a 7.2. They haven't come out with that information yet. They usually do it late in summer or midsummer time. So it's your responsibility, not the instructor, not your program director. It's your responsibility. And you have to find access to this through the edTPA website. And you can find that by linking here. And you can just type in edtpacom. It's a really easy web address, but this website is your landing page for when you're actually taking the edTPA. It has links to all of the resources that you need. You'll have to create an account in order to access this information, but it's the same account that you will use to actually submit your edTPA. You have to do it, so why not do it early? And you're welcome to do that now. And so it's your job to make sure that you're reviewing all of this information, that you have the right handbook for your semester, and this will tell you right here, find it via your educator preparation program. So you will get access to this during your student teaching semester, but it's your job to make sure that it's the correct version that's being used for that year. And if your instructor hands out the handbook and you notice, oh, this is from 2019-20, make sure you ask them, is this the most current, so that you know you're using the most recent handbook. Okay, so what do you have to do? The handbook will walk you through what you have to do, but it's actually not my favorite resource. You can see it's broken up by tasks, and there's a little intro section. You should certainly read this, and this would be a good place to start your reading for this module. In the previous version of our syllabus, you were required to read this, so you should certainly skim it at this point and become familiar with it. But I'm going to walk you through a resource that I think is even more helpful. So essentially what you do is you work with your cooperating teacher during student teaching to select an appropriate strategy, an essential literacy strategy, and a topic to teach 3 to 5 lessons. Most of you will teach 3 lessons, but I have seen edTPAs that go up to 5 lessons, but you're only required to do 3. I always say keep it simple, submit 3. I should also add here, the reason that I'm the one creating this video for this class is that I'm an edTPA scorer, an official scorer, and have been trained in how to score the edTPA, and I know the edTPA in and out, and I can tell you the parts that are tricky and the parts that give people a hard time, and I can tell you as a scorer what I'm specifically looking for in students. So I thought, since I have this understanding, I would love to share it with all of you so that you know the ins and outs and the tricks and the secrets that I know. Okay, so you have to submit evidence, including a literacy learning segment. So learning segment is the edTPA way of saying lesson plans. And what I like about the language learning segment is that it allows you to present the 3 lessons that you would like to among a broader, for example, unit plan. So maybe you've planned a whole unit on studying plants in your classroom, but you're only going to bring us into the 3 lessons where you're reading a book about plants and photosynthesis, for example, and then teaching them a strategy for comprehending that nonfiction text. So we're going to see just 3 snippet lessons, a segment of that broader unit plan. So you shouldn't be thinking of your edTPA lessons as a full unit plan. You can't really do a unit in 3 lessons. So it's a really quick snapshot, a segment of the teaching that you would do within a broader unit of study. That's kind of a helpful way to think about your learning segment. So you do, your evidence is a literacy learning segment, your lesson plans. You're going to write commentaries, those are the papers, and you're going to have assessment samples of student work. You're going to develop an assessment, give it to them, and collect those samples. You will also submit 2 videos of your teaching and then student work samples for the other things that you've done in this learning segment. Templates and handbooks can be found at the edTPA website, but your student teaching seminar instructor will help you to find the correct one. And the School of Education requires you to work on your edTPA during student teaching. But you should know that this is not your official submission. So when you finish your student teaching and you upload your portfolio to your instructor, that's not you submitting the edTPA. You actually have to go to the edTPA website that Pearson runs, this one over here, and you have to register and you have to actually upload your portfolio. You're not done until you've put in that code, paid the $300, and uploaded to Pearson. You are going to be encouraged to do this during your student teaching, and I will tell you that the students who submit during their student teaching semester historically do better and have better pass rates than the people who extend beyond the semester and drag out their submission. So you want to get this done during student teaching when you have access to the instructor who's there to help you on your edTPA. So again, this is going to link you to the handbook. We're going to take a closer look at that. But these are 2 good resources that I also encourage you to take a look at. These are both the versions for the 2019-2020 academic year. So again, you'll want to make sure you have the correct version for the year that you're taking it. The Making Good Choices document is a really nice background document. If you're looking for more reading about the edTPA, like what can I do going into my fall student teaching to really set me up extremely well to be ready to hit the ground running, read that Making Good Choices document. It helps you understand the kind of professional conversation that you need to have with your host teacher and your supervisor as you're thinking about the choices you have to make around edTPA. But this document here is what I call the secret document. It's not a secret in the sense that it's published, it's available, it is labeled clearly as a candidate support resource, but this is the document that your scorer has actually been trained on. So what people don't realize is that this rubric level progression document is the one that contains the answer to the question, what exactly do I have to write on the edTPA? Because it's not the lesson plans or even the videos or the student work samples that trip people up on the edTPA. It's the writing, it's the commentaries and the things that you have to type and prepare. And this document tells you exactly how to write. So we're going to use that document as our sounding board for this training. So I'm actually going to close the handbook, which seems counterintuitive, but we're going to focus on this rubric progressions document. So this is one that you will certainly want to download. If it was me in the fall doing my student teaching, I would have a printed hard copy of this document. Yes, I would have, Dr. Sturm would have a hard copy of this document that I would highlight, I would mark up, I would use this document. This is your everything. So when it comes time for your edTPA, you'll want to make sure you have a hard copy of that. So here is a quick checklist of everything that you have to submit for the whole entire edTPA. The stuff that's highlighted in yellow up here is what you're submitting just for this class. So you can see we're only doing one task out of 4 total. And you'll see that it's a mix of, in task 1, the literacy planning happens before you teach. This is going to have that context for learning that you've all written already. It's going to have the lesson plans, your instructional materials, they go in a different document. Your literacy assessment, that's the rubric you've all planned, in a different document. And then the commentary paper. So all of these are a mix of some sort of evidence for what you've created, and then a commentary paper explaining the things that you've done. That's what all of the tasks are. Task 2 happens during teaching. This is your actual teaching video. We've always in New York State had the requirement to submit videos of your teaching in order to become certified, and that's just moved now into the edTPA. So you're going to take 2 video clips of your teaching. And this is actually where the gradual release of responsibility comes in, because when you look in the handbook at the requirements of the video clips, they are looking for very specific things. They are looking for you to be modeling, very specifically, modeling your strategy. Then they are looking for you to be engaging your students in some sort of guided practice. And then they're also looking in this task for you to have a moment where you are allowing your students to independently apply the strategy. So those 3 things, modeling, guided practice, application, that's the gradual release of responsibility. That's the whole reason why task 1 and our entire 390 class looks the way it does. It is designed to help you prepare for the edTPA. So when it comes to your student teaching, you're not Googling furiously what the heck is guided practice. You already know that's lesson 2. So the lessons that you're doing in this 390 class are meant to be preparing you for your student teaching. You should do your edTPA exactly like you did your Inch 390 project. And I have really exciting news to share, and that is I have hounded the people who took Inch 390 last year, who student taught this fall of 2019. I've reached out to those people. Many of them have excitedly emailed me to say, Dr. Sturm, I passed the edTPA. And they all are using their Inch 390 materials to help them think about how to write their edTPAs during their student teaching. And every single person who has reached out to me to say they took their edTPA, they submitted it, has passed. And some of them have passed with distinction, and they use the exact same format that I'm teaching you right now for 390. So that is super exciting. Early unsubstantiated data that I have collected anecdotally, but it's good data, and it shows me that this is important, that we take the time in this class to prepare you so that you're ready when it comes time for student teaching. Okay, so task 3 is assessment, and this happens after teaching. This is where you take that rubric that you used, that you created in task 1, and grade your student work, and then they want you to do some analysis work with that. I'm not going to focus on that right now. And then here's task 4, that math. So you can see you've got a math context for learning, which I think you all did for 380. You've got a segment overview, you've got an assessment, an evaluation, that's the assessment criteria, student work samples, and then that re-engagement lesson. I know you were doing that for 380, and then a commentary paper. So that some of that should sound familiar too, that you're working on for 380. But just a quick snapshot, this is what you have to do for the edTPA. We're going to focus only on task 1 because that's the final project for Inch 390 in this class. So when you really drill down into task 1, here are the things that you have to submit. There are A, B, C, D, E. I had to count that. There are 5 different things that you have to submit for this final project and for the edTPA. The first one is your context for learning with the template. You've already done that. That's already been submitted, and you got a grade on it. You got feedback on it. Revise that for the final project, but that is done. And you can see they are super specific. Arial, 11-point font, 1-inch margins on all sides of this document. They are really specific about the formatting, so you should be too. Now, you've all done this final project in a Google Doc, which is not one of the supported file types. So when you do this for your actual edTPA, you're going to want to make sure that you're working in Word or one of these accepted files. So part B is your lesson plans for the learning segment. No more than 4 pages per lesson plan, and you're submitting 3 to 5 lessons. So we are modifying this for you all this semester because of COVID. You only have to submit lesson 1, and if you did it, lesson 2, but you've already submitted that. You've already gotten your grade on that. You are good to go. All you have to do is revise, and you'll resubmit. So part A done, part B done. You're just revising and resubmitting. Part C is your instructional materials. So with your lesson plan 1 this semester and 2, you put those attachments at the end of your lesson plan. When you do your edTPA and your final project for this class, you actually pull out all of the instructional materials and they go in a different file. It's awkward and it's clunky and it's actually hard for your scorer, but that's just how they want things done. So that's what we're going to do. So this is your graphic organizer, your anchor chart, your vocabulary words, any slides that you've created. All of that stuff goes into its own file called instructional materials. No more than 5 pages of your key materials per lesson plan. So if you included images of the text file that you were using, you'll want to select just the key ones that you used, for example, in lesson 1 for the modeling section. So you can't have more than 5 pages per lesson, but they all get put into one file, clearly labeled on top. I'll show you in the sample what this looks like, but it should say Lesson 1, instructional materials, Lesson 2, instructional materials, and they should be put in the order in which they are used in the learning segment. So everything is neat and organized in this. Part D is your assessment. This is going to be your rubric. This is going to be your exit ticket for lesson 1 or your quick check-in quiz. There's no limit on the number of pages for your assessment, but most of you are going to have 1 per lesson. You do not need to repeat assessments. So if you're using the same rubric for lessons 1, 2, and 3, you don't need to put it in there 3 times. 1 time will suffice, and you can simply label it as lesson 1, 2, and 3 assessment rubric. And they should appear in the order that they are used. And the last thing, so you might have noticed you've done your context for learning. You've gotten feedback and done your lesson plans already. We are waiving lesson plan 3 and 2 if you did not do it. You only need lesson plan 1. You've done your instructional materials. You've done your literacy assessment. You've planned parts A through D are done already. So all you have to focus on for your final project is your commentary paper, and that's going to be the focus of the rest of this video. So no more than 9 pages. So yes, you will be writing a 9-page paper in the next couple of weeks. Give yourself the time and space and energy to be able to do that. And it will be Arial size 11, 1-inch margins, and you'll respond to all of the prompts, talking about after you've planned but before you have taught. So this will all be written in the future tense. When I teach this, how I have planned this. Okay, so we're going to take a really close look at all of the parts, those 5 parts, what gets submitted. I'm going to gloss over the context for learning because you've all done this already. You've all written one, but I will just point out this is the blank template. You don't need to see this because you've already seen it. You've all gotten a grade and feedback. But I will just remind you that these 2 tables, this is from the sample that I posted for this class. These tables are everything. These tables dictate how the rest of your whole entire edTPA is written. So if you put in here that you've got IEPs for ELA in your class, you have students with IEPs, you must talk about those IEPs and those students' needs throughout your entire edTPA. You will see throughout the edTPA there are these sort of manila beigey colored boxes, and that's your signal that you have to talk about the students with IEPs. So when it asks you to talk about modifications you've made, if you don't talk about your IEPs, you get an automatic 1, which is a failing score on the edTPA. So whoever you put in these tables, and you can see the sample has some IEPs and some behavioral needs and some students reading below grade level, a lot of students reading below grade level in this class. Those kiddos need to be addressed at every single checkpoint in the edTPA. So that's the context for learning. Next is the lesson plans. There is no formal template for the edTPA lesson plans. They say in the handbook that the template that you use is totally up to your college or your student teaching situation, but they do tell you what your lessons should include. So what we did as an INCH team in the School of Ed at Nazareth College was took all of those requirements and made them requirements in our Nazareth Undergraduate School of Education lesson plan template. This should look really familiar. You all use this template to create lessons 1 and 2 if you did them. So this is the lesson plan template. All you have to do is revise your lessons, but they should be no more than 4 pages per lesson without your attachments. Remember, those go in a separate file. Every lesson should be clearly labeled at the top, lesson 1, 2, 3. You should have your state standards with the number and the full text. If you're only using a portion of the standard, you can revise it. You need a clear learning objective, which you all learned how to write in this program. You all need a formal and or informal assessment. What kind of assessment? What is being used? What is being assessed? All of you will have that. That's a box on our lesson plan. And then you need your strategies and your learning tasks. And you should talk about what the teacher does and what the students do. And that's why in our template, when you get down to the instructional flow box, you can see that we have teacher will, students will. Maybe that's annoying to you and that drives you bonkers when you're writing your lesson plans, but now you know why we have it. The edTPA requires it. So we created our template to align with what's required on the edTPA, and that's just another way that we are setting you up for success. So that's part B. So what we're going to do is take a quick look at the sample lessons for an edTPA. And there's a couple ways you can get to these sample lessons. This is probably the easiest way, but if you go to our INCH 390 course shared materials folder, however you get to it, I've got a bookmark so that I can always find it. And if you click through and find the course assignments, find the lesson planning resources, find the final project materials, there is a sample final project link. You can also get more quickly to it by going right here. All project materials are found here. I will also link it on our Moodle page. There will be multiple ways to get to this folder. You should find this folder. In it is the sample final project. This is an entire edTPA written from start to finish. And how I wrote this is I used a student from Eng 390 that I had last semester who passed her edTPA with a really good score, And I asked her if I could use her Eng 390 materials and modify it. And so I did. So I'm not even going to tell you the student's name because I've changed it so much to make it a really strong and really obvious sample. But this is what that student based her real edTPA on, and she passed and did really well. So here are all of the things that you need. So you can see this is the final project outline. We are requiring that you submit that project outline again. And there's a slight little change to it that I'll show you in a moment. But here's that context for learning. Here's the lesson plans. And that's what we're actually going to look at in a second. I already have it open. I don't need it again. Here are her instructional materials. Here are the assessments she planned. And here's the commentary that she wrote. So take a look at her lesson plans. I'm not going to read them out loud. Instead, what I want you to do is actually pause the video right now and read from start to finish this person's lesson plans, and you'll see that she followed the guidelines really strictly. So lesson 1, which is the longest one, right? It's the modeling lesson with all that good language in there for modeling. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, and she used almost every single inch of space that she could for the first lesson. So you'll see lesson 2 is only about 2.5 pages, and then lesson 3, that independent application, is less than that, 2.25. So stop right now and please read the STAR student sample lesson plans. Okay, now that you've read the lesson plans, you can see how this edTPA learning segment has been structured around the strategy of synthesize. So that was her essential literacy strategy, to synthesize. What I've created that I think is really helpful as a scorer, let me explain how this got developed. So as a scorer, the tool that you're given looks like what I have highlighted right now. So when I open up a new lesson plan, a new edTPA to score, I print off this rubric for me to use. And you can see it's got the score levels 1 through 5. And this is for every task, 1, 2, 3. You have a different score for your math task. I only score the literacy tasks, so just know that you actually have 2 different people looking at your edTPA. And so this would have 3 full tasks with all 15 rubrics for tasks 1, 2, and 3. I modified it for this class, so you're only looking at task 1. But this is actually the instrument that your scorer would have in front of them. Down here is what I've added, and I actually use this now when I'm scoring real edTPAs. And what this is a really quick, organized snapshot of what I'm reading on that initial pass through a person's edTPA materials. So my first step is always to read task 1, and you should also know that your scorer can only see the task that they are currently scoring. So when I'm scoring task 1, I can't see your videos. I can't see your assessment task. When I'm scoring task 3 on your assessment, I don't have access to task 1. I already submitted that score. So they are actually scoring in the order in which everything appears. So it's really important that you include all of the important and essential information as you're working on your edTPA. Okay, so this little table down here is a notes box that I included for myself. And I use this when I'm scoring every single edTPA because I found myself like writing these little sticky notes and making these little sheets all over the place. And I was writing the same thing every single time. And this box includes the important essential things. So students' needs, because they are so important, those IEPs, those below grade level readers, all of those essential things that come from, remember, these boxes that are your everything. Whenever I'm reading a context for learning, I pull those things out first. So you can see in the sample, she had students who had testing accommodations, additional time, directions read, directions repeated and paraphrased, extra wait time, written work can be oral, dictated, or word processed. And then she has a whole bunch of kiddos reading below grade level who get leveled text and guided reading and frequent formative assessment. So what I would like you to do right now is to file, make a copy of this score summary form for task 1. And I want you to go along through this sample scoring on this sheet. So the first thing that I'd like you to do, all of this information in these 3 boxes appeared in the student's context for learning or in the lesson plans. So what were the students' needs? That comes right from this table. So copy those over and put those in. What was the central focus? There are only 2 choices. It's either reading comprehension or writing composition. This was a reading one, so it's comprehension. What was her essential literacy strategy? Did you notice related skills anywhere in the lesson plans? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. How about a language function or language demands or language supports? Did you catch any of those? And then here is where I really want you to focus. What happens in lesson 1? So this is a really brief description, and I'm actually going to show you one other file in the sample project that is going to be super helpful, and it's the final project outline. There was a method to our madness in making you do the final project outline. So this is the outline for that final project. And here's what makes me really happy when I'm a scorer and I open a fresh new edTPA to score. When somebody has a cover sheet that has all of this information for me, yes, it takes up precious space on your lesson plans because you can only have 4 pages each. So if you have 3 lessons, you can only have 12 pages. But notice this star student's lesson plans end on page 10. She's got 2 extra pages. If it were me, I would stick this outline in. So you all had to do this outline. I want you to notice that the outline is now going to include this box called language demands. So we want you to add in the language demands that we're going to talk about later. Don't worry if you don't know what that is right now. That comes in the rubrics later on. But the rest of it is a cut and paste job from what you all submitted. And this is what I love to see because it helps me fill out this scoring sheet so easily. So the student needs comes right from the context for learning, central focus, essential literacy strategy was synthesized, her related skills. Oh, I forgot, but I can hop right over here and find them. Formal assessments described. And then I can even find those language demands. And oh, look here. There's a place where you've already briefly described your lesson activities and the assessment that you're going to use. So please stop now and fill in all of this information using the context for learning, which you can find here and in the slide that I was referring to. So here's where you're going to find the student needs. So use the context for learning, the final project outline, and the lesson plans that you just finished reading, and fill in the rest of this scoring form down here on this part. Don't worry about the scores yet. We're not there yet. Just fill in the notes. So stop now and fill that in. So when you're done, your scoring form should look like this. So this is a quick, easy reminder for me as the scorer that there are needs in this class in terms of the IEPs, the below grade level readers. Here's the central focus, here's the strategy, here's the two related skills. The language function she chose was synthesize. Even though you don't know what a language function is, there it was. She was super clear. We've got vocabulary and discourse as those demands, and the supports provided were a graphic organizer, vocabulary instruction. This comes from deeper in the commentary paper, so if you don't have some of this, that's okay. We'll talk about it later. And then here are those brief descriptions. I cut and paste right from the students' lesson brief descriptions in the block plans. I cut and paste those descriptions here. So you can see in the first lesson, she uses an anchor chart to teach the synthesized strategy. Then she teaches them the vocabulary, and she had those nifty little vocab bookmarks. And then she introduced the graphic organizer and the scoring rubric. She read aloud a text called Freedom Riders. She modeled how to synthesize with the graphic organizer using a think aloud. She modeled how to write a synthesis paragraph. She modeled how to score the writing in the graphic organizer with the rubric. And then she had a really quick quiz to assess. And if you go back to the sample and you open up the instructional materials, I'm going to bounce ahead a little bit here. Remember that the instructional materials, no more than 5 pages per lesson, labeled super clearly, should be in the order of appearance. You are not including assessments here. They go in a different file. So if we look over at the instructional materials, you'll see they're labeled instructional materials, lesson 1. Here's the anchor chart. Super cute. And on the anchor chart, it has the language she's expecting them to use. At first I was thinking, then I was thinking, now I'm thinking. So when you combine what you know you're reading with what you're reading, your thinking can change. Here's the vocabulary bookmarks that she taught in lesson 1. Here's the synthesized graphic organizer, and you can see this is for lessons 1, 2, and 3. She's not repeating it 3 times. It's there for all 3 lessons, and it's labeled super clearly. That's how they're going to synthesize. And then she's got Freedom Readers photocopies. I would just add to this lesson 1 so that it's, again, super clear what lesson this is for. And there's the copies of the text. Sample paragraph for modeling in lesson 1. So this is what she would use to model. She included the rubric in the materials for lesson 1, and that's because it is actually being used as part of the instruction in lesson 1. It's not being used to assess the students in lesson 1. It's being used to show them, to teach them how to score themselves, because she's scoring her own writing. So it's included here in the instructional materials. And then for lessons 2 and 3, you can see she's also included photocopies of the pages. She's got a modified rubric. So I would have removed this and put this in the assessment materials, but she included it here. So I left it so you could see what that would look like. And then, so that's the instructional materials. And then the sample literacy assessments, they should again be one long file, all of the assessments used. There's no page limit here. Include every written assessment and instructions for them if they're given orally. So for example, if you're doing reading comprehension questions and you're asking them out loud and that's how you're assessing your kiddos, you should include those questions and maybe some possible answers that you would expect. Everything should be labeled clearly. Everything should be in the order of appearance in the lesson. You're only including blank copies of your assessments here, not your student work samples. That goes in task 3 later on. Your assessments should monitor your students' learning of all your related skills and your essential literacy strategy at multiple points across the segment. So here's the method behind the madness of having you create an exit ticket. So the exit ticket is checking in on day one that they understand the strategy, and then using the same rubric on lessons 2 and 3. So you're checking at multiple points that they understand the strategy, that they can use it with a peer, and then they can use it on their own. So you're continuing that monitoring with the same instrument repeatedly across the whole segment. That's why we planned it that way. And your assessments should be modified for the students noted in your context for learning. So on your edTPA, it's not enough to say the students with IEPs will have a separate rubric for the assignment. You actually have to create it for those students. So we'll take a look at how the STAR student did that. So here's the exit ticket for lesson 1. For the students with IEPs, this would be done out loud, so there's no modification needed. It would just be given orally. But you can see for the synthesizing rubric, here is the version for the on-grade level students. Here is the modified for specific students version. It's simplified. There are fewer criteria. And the language is a little bit more simple, and you can see that she removed that prior learning writing mechanics from their requirement, and their level of mastery is set to a different scale. So she's still requiring, 2/3 of the rubric should be met, but it's a slightly different rubric. And then for students with IEPs and below grade level students, she's also created a checklist for them in order to complete that writing assessment. So we'll talk later about how this is incorporated, but this is another modification that comes in for the assessment. So you've now seen the lesson plans, the lesson 1 as the modeling, lesson 2 they're going to work in groups to complete that text Ida B. Wells, and she's going to pull the below grade level readers and the students with IEPs to complete it with her facilitating, and they're going to be assessed with a rubric here, an exit ticket quiz here, and then independently they'll be doing the same graphic organizer, the same synthesis paragraph, the second half of the Ida B. Wells text, and she'll be supporting her students with IEPs by reading that text, or the below grade level readers, collect that work, score it, and she plans to conference with the students to go over how they did. So this gives me, as a scorer, a really nice, quick and easy way so that I'm not flipping around and trying to, there's no flipping when you're scoring. It's all read on the computer screen through PDF. So this allows me to organize all of my thinking, and I can tell just by completing this part of my scoring, I can tell if someone's going to pass their edTPA. If I can't read the lesson plan, the context for learning, the instructional materials, the assessments document, if I can't read through someone's documents and very quickly figure out what's the strategy, what's the skills, what's being assessed, and how's it being taught, if I can't quickly pull that out, I already know that that person's not going to pass. So you're all going to have a super leg up on the other people taking the edTPA, because we are asking you to do this right now in 390 in a low stakes, well supported way so that you can have practice with it. Let's call this, I'm modeling right now in this video, let's call your experience in 390 the guided practice, and when you do your edTPA, it will be the independent application. Oh, this is so meta, which I'm now realizing. Okay, I just had a moment, forgive me. Okay, so let's talk about the commentary. So this is what you are doing that's new for the final project in this class. Everything else up to this point has been revise and resubmit, revise and resubmit. You don't have to write that third lesson plan or the second one if you didn't already do it. If you really want to, for some reason, like you want that whole edTPA experience, you can write that third lesson. It is a quick one. It's the independent application lesson. You're welcome to do that. I will happily take a look at any third lesson plan and give you feedback on it. If you are just somebody who like needs the whole product done to get yourself ready, but it's not required for this class. This part is going to be the hardest part of the edTPA for all of you. It is hard. Just like accept that right now. It's hard. But knowing that, you can do some things to help yourself as you think about preparing for writing your commentary. So thing one is just like the context for learning, there is a specific template that you need to use in order to write your commentary. So please find this template. You can find it in our final project materials folder. You can find it in this link. I will link it in the Moodle module. Find this template. Things that you need to know about this template. You cannot go beyond 9 pages, and you can see just the prompts are roughly 2.5 pages long. So that's 7-ish pages of unique writing that you are allowed to do, 6-ish, 7-ish. So it's not really that much. 6.5 pages of writing about something that you're going to have a lot to say. It's really not a lot of space. And most people have a hard time trimming from everything they want to say. Instead of, you're probably sitting here thinking, oh my God, I have to write 6.5 pages. You're going to find that it's not enough space. And if you're doing your edTPA properly, you should feel like, God, what can I cut? Rather than, ooh, what can I add? So if you find yourself thinking, how am I going to get to 9 pages? Or you finish the whole thing and you're at 5, you've not written enough. You should feel strained by the 9-page limit. Another thing about this is please leave the brackets. The brackets are there on purpose. I have no idea why the edTPA people want you to have the brackets around their writing, but just leave them. It's the same thing for the context for learning. Some of you took the brackets out. You got to leave them. That's like the signpost for your scorer to know like what you've actually written, and it goes into the brackets. Another thing you need to know is that your scorer has been trained to read your commentary paper from start to finish, looking for answers to any of the questions in the whole entire document. So what that should give you peace of mind about is that some of the questions sound a little bit similar. Like, for example, how do your standards address the following things? Might feel similar to explain how your plans build on one another. Just know that your scorer is looking holistically at this document. So if you've got the right answer in the wrong place, they're going to still score it as being in the right place, as being correct. So that should give you peace of mind, because some of this is confusing. The prompts on the edTPA are historically, notoriously confusing. But don't worry, I'm here to debunk all of it and to help you figure it out. So, I don't want to skip this. Your planning commentary must include responses to all of the prompts, don't skip any, and all parts of the prompts. So, for example, did I close the commentary document like a darn fool? I'm going to actually open up the sample one. So for example, in this question here, which is my favorite question to hate, it says, given the central focus, so given reading comprehension, describe how the standards and objectives, there are 2 things, they are bolded, so you have to talk about both of them, within your learning segment. So how do your standards and your objectives, all of them, so the one standard you have going throughout, and we're talking about the literacy standard here. How does your literacy standard and the learning objectives that you've written, the students will be able to for every single lesson, how do they address the essential literacy strategy, the related skills that support the use of the strategy, and the reading and writing connections? You've got to talk about standards and objectives for all 3 of those things separately. It's awful. And you have to make sure you do all of them in full and complete. So make sure you're responding to all parts of all of the prompts. Pay attention to the verbs. If they say to identify something, all you have to do is tell it. You don't need to describe. If they say describe, that's where you need to come in with lots of detail to tell about what you identified. If they say explain, that's describing how you planned or did something. If they ask you to justify, that means to give your rationale. Why did you do that thing? If they ask you to cite evidence, and this is one of the biggest downfalls of some people, they literally want you to go to your samples or to your work and literally to talk about individual pieces of evidence that show what you are describing. This happens once in task 1, and if you don't have specific examples, you will not get a higher score on the rubric than you could. I'll make sure that I point that out when it comes. Watch out for questions that have and or. If you and something, so if they say, talk about how your students' background knowledge and or their cultural assets come into play, and you only talk about their background knowledge, you'll get a lower score than if you talked about background knowledge and the other thing that I forgot, I already said, cultural assets. And is often how you get yourself into the 4 zone. And then the single best piece of advice I have is to write your commentary with the understanding rubric levels file open. And that's that one that I said your scorer has been trained on, it's your everything, and it's already open here. So you should make sure you have that file open. Okay, so the planning commentary is 5 questions because there's one on this page that are asking you to talk about what you planned. So you haven't taught anything yet, you've just planned. So in the first question, they want to know all about your central focus, your related skills, the reading and writing connections, that strategy you chose. So explain all of that, connect it out to the standards. In question 2, they want to know how the knowledge of your students that you have informed your teaching. So how did you tap into their prior academic knowledge? That's the one that says cite evidence. So you need to be super specific. You're going to do some make-believe in this class because you don't actually have these students and you didn't actually teach them these lessons. But what personal, cultural, community assets did you use in order to plan your teaching? So they want to know a little bit about your students. And then question 3 is all about differentiation, supporting your students. Justify how your understanding that you talked about in question 2, how did that inform the supports that you provided? And then justify how your strategies were appropriate for the whole class. Here's an and or, whole class, individuals, and or groups. You're going to do all of those. And here are 2 of those boxes that say, warning, warning, if you had students with IEPs or you had students in that context for learning chart, you better address their needs here. And if you don't, you will get an automatic 1 on this writing. Okay, so those manila boxes are the ones to pay attention for. And then question 4 is all about language. So we're going to talk, I will do some teaching / explaining about the language function when we get there. And then question 5 is assessment. How did you monitor their learning? What assessments did you plan? Why did you plan them? How are you checking in throughout? And then here's the manila box. What did you do for your students with IEPs? So all of that is being assessed in task 1. So when you look at it, they want to know, what are you teaching? What do you know about your students? How are you supporting them? How are you helping them to learn about the new language you're teaching them? And then how are you assessing? Those are all basic questions. You could all explain those answers in detail if we were just having a conversation about your kiddos. So now it's cracking the code in how to write in a way that will get you a good score. So while the edTPA rubrics, and if you look back at the handbook, I don't even look at the rubrics anymore, but if you look back at the handbook, it includes rubrics for every single prompt that, or set of prompts that is being assessed. So this is what the first rubric looks like in planning for literacy context. So you can see it's got levels 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is loosely how you're being graded. So at a level 3, your plans will build on each other. They'll support learning. You've got clear connections to skills. So you could write your edTPA thinking that you're at a level 3 based on the rubrics, which is why I always say you should look at the rubric level progression document, because it's much better than the rubrics. So what I want you to do now is we're actually going to enter the sample student's commentary. So the first rubric, and I'm going to bounce over to the rubric level progressions document, because this is the one I told you is key. This is going to tell me how I get my score. So looking at the rubric, you can see it's rubric 1, planning for literacy learning, and the essential question is, how do your plans build students' understanding of an essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing, and the skills that support that strategy? So I'm going to bounce over to this. You can see the same question is posted here. This is what we're looking for. It's got a little more detail about that guiding question. So we're looking at, can you develop an essential literacy strategy and teach it to your students? Some key concepts: aligned. Your lessons must be aligned. You've heard me talk about alignment a lot in this INCH program. This means, do your standards, your objectives, the strategy you chose, the way you're assessing, do all of those things align nicely? They have to align. So if you say that your objective is students will be able to complete a graphic organizer finding the key details from a text, then the standard should also align with finding key details. Your assessment should actually do that. Your assessment shouldn't be a quiz that is not related or has to do with writing mechanics, or the thing that you're collecting can't be a paragraph that has nothing to do with key details. All those things need to align. Another key concept for this rubric is content inaccuracies. If there's anything in your commentary writing, in your lesson plans, in your instructional materials that is wrong, like you just got a concept wrong, then you could do poorly on this rubric. So the essential literacy strategy is what we're teaching our readers to do. There's a lengthy edTPA definition. The related skills are the sub-skills that they need to learn in order to do that thing, that strategy. And then this meaningful context. So meaningful context is use of literacy in students' everyday lives or texts that reflect the experiences and interests of the students. So a meaningful context example is a worksheet graphic organizer with sentence frames used to support their writing in an expository text where they choose to write to an authentic audience. So for example, the lunch is gross, we don't want it. We're going to write to our school administrator, and you provide them the sentence frames or a graphic organizer for that. That's an authentic audience and a meaningful context to that writing. Pretty much the only way to get a meaningful context in your edTPA is if your lessons emerge from the students and they tell you, like, oh, we saw this problem, we want to do research and we want to read, and you come up with a strategy to help them to do that. Most of you are not going to have that kind of a context. Most of you will talk to your host teacher, you'll come up with a strategy, you'll teach it in a contrived setting, you'll give them a book to read that they didn't necessarily pick, and it's not a meaningful, authentic context. Don't worry about that. Let that one go. This is one rubric where most people are going to get a 3. Another thing that I want you to understand about your edTPA, so you can see by looking at the rubric that you have a chance to get anything from a 1 to a 5. There's no such thing as a 0 on your edTPA. If you get a 1, consider that a fail. 2s and 3s are considered passing. 3 is the bar that all of you start at. Your trainer is trained to enter your edTPA documents thinking about a level 3. Everyone starts at a level 3. That's where the understanding rubric level progression document starts. When you start unpacking the levels, they start at a level 3, and you either go up from that or down from that based on what you've written and how you've written it. So that's an important thing to understand. Another important thing to understand is that the level 5 is pretty much unattainable. I think in my 2 years of scoring, I've given maybe 3 level 5s on all the edTPAs I've ever scored put together, maybe 3. It is just not expected that you're going to get a level 5. Very rarely are people getting a 5. And I think it's actually kind of evil that the 5 is even on the rubrics, because it makes you think that that's an attainable, easy thing to do. Oh, I just do X, Y, and Z and I get a 5. Just let go of the level 5. And I know for some of you super achievers, that's hard because you want everything to be perfect. You want to achieve to your highest possible capability. I'm telling you now, just let go of the 5. A lot of level 5 relies on you being able to control things about your class that you just can't control. And Rubric 1 is the perfect example. You must have a unique, authentic, and meaningful experience in order for your students to be able to, in order for you to be able to get a level 5 on Rubric 1. Most of you won't have that opportunity. None of you will probably have that opportunity. So just let go of that level 5 on all of the rubrics. Your goal should be a level 3. So here's how you use this document. It tells you in this brownish box your primary sources of evidence. So for Rubric 1, we are looking at the context for learning, and that's because you have to be able to talk about your students with IEPs. And we're looking at prompt 1 of your commentary. And they also will do that strategic review of your lesson plans and your instructional materials that I started this whole thing with. So the scoring decision rules, this is for if there's multiple criteria that are being looked at, or if there's an auto 1, which is a fail. There is an auto 1 for Rubric 1. If you have content inaccuracies, if something is just wrong, you will get a 1. If you have a misalignment, so if you are teaching something and assessing something different, or you're teaching something and you chose a standard that doesn't align, you'll get an auto 1. So this is a rubric where you can get a 1, an automatic fail, even if everything else is beautiful and wonderful and perfect. Okay, so this is, as we saw up here, based on prompt 1. So let's go over and take a look at what prompt 1 asks you to do. And if I go back to, I'm going to go actually to the full sample that's written and take a look. Oh, this yellow up here is just a reminder that you can't copy this. It's a sample. Everyone has access to it. I am the sole author of this work, and if you try to submit this for your edTPA, you could get a failing score. They run every edTPA submission through a plagiarism detector, so it will be very evident if you have copied. That's important to you because you're going to want to borrow some of the language. And last semester, I didn't fail anyone for this, but I had a lot of students who I said, you have copied the sample too closely. You need to revise. It's really hard to have a solid passing sample in front of you and write something different. So my advice to you is to read start to finish what was written in question 1, close the document, go to your own document and write start to finish your own response. Maybe even take notes so it's not verbatim so that you remember what you want to include. But do not open the sample, put yours right next to it, and type your response reading the sample. You will plagiarize. There's just no way that you won't, because it's a solid sample and your mind won't be able to shut off what's written. So that's my advice to you. And I'm going to be very picky as I'm grading these to look for plagiaristic kind of writing. Okay, so that's my advice, that's my warning. Let's take a look at prompt 1. So prompt 1 is made up of parts A, B, and C, and they all go into this first rubric, rubric 1. So it says, describe the central focus and the essential literacy strategy for comprehending, you can ignore composing, that you will teach in the learning segment. So you can see the writing that's been done here about this. Question 2, given the central focus, describe how the standards, learning objectives within the learning segment address the essential literacy strategy, the related skills, and the reading and writing connections. And question C, explain how your plans build on each other to help students make connections between the essential strategy to comprehend and the related skills to support the use of the strategy in meaningful contexts. So that's what they're asking you to write about in question 1. I would like you to pause the video right now and read the sample. Welcome back. Once you've finished reading the sample, we're going to take a look at the rubric and we're going to score. Before we do that, I'll quickly just point out that I highlighted I bold-faced the important elements. This is my edit, not the way that the edTPA was submitted, because I wanted you all to be able to see how to structure your response. So the things that I have bold-faced are the things that you are welcome to cut and paste or copy into your document. They are the stems for responding to the prompts that pretty much everybody's going to have. So the central focus is comprehension. You're all going to have this language, so copy it. The essential literacy strategy I will teach in order to comprehend. You can all have that language. It's in the stem, is synthesizing. And the related skills that are required are locating key details and adding the details to what they already know. So the bold-faced, copy it. This one is a very simple response. Part B is pretty complicated, and it should take you this amount of writing to respond to part B. Given the central focus, how have the standards and objectives. So you should start with, given the central focus, the New York State Next Gen standard I selected is, you can copy all of that. You will all have that as your stem. And then you'll paste the standard here. So she chose determine a theme or central idea, summarize it. This standard will address the strategy of, fill in your own strategy. Please don't leave synthesizing there, but you're all going to have that same stem. And here's where you need to talk about, how does your standard match up? So this requires students in grade 5 to be able to locate details and to be able to synthesize. This lesson asks them to do synthesizing. The social studies standard, you can talk about your social studies standard here. That's a good idea. This is a cross-curricular plan. And then what you've got to do, so this part up here is all about the standards. So put your standards in and explain how you are connecting to the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. The learning objective for lesson 1 is, you can all have that, and then paste your learning objective. Oops. And then this learning objective is directly linked to, you can all have that too, the related skills of the lesson, which are the skills that a reader must do in order to synthesize, connecting back to the essential literacy strategy. All elements of this lesson will be planned accordingly to the New York State standards, connecting back again to the standards. This particular objective ensures that students will understand what synthesizing is. You are going to want to copy my language here because you all planned similar kinds of lessons. You've got to find a way to paraphrase and put it in your own words. Only what is bolded may be copied. So you first describe what you do in lesson 1 with your objective, your essential literacy strategy, the connection back to the standard. All of your objectives have to do, boom, boom, those things. Then, learning objective 2, guess what's happening? Talk about the standard, talk about the objective. And then objective 3, talk about how they're going to demonstrate their understanding. Then, the standards and the learning objectives will address the reading and writing connections. So for most of you, that's happening, the reading and writing connections happening in lessons 2 and 3. So write about it here. How? What are you having them do? Most of you are having them read a text, do some kind of graphic organizer writing, paraphrasing or synthesizing or summarizing or finding key details and writing up a little paragraph about it that you're going to then grade. And your ultimate goal is to see if they've comprehended. So somehow you've got to address all of these things in one neat paragraph. So this is a sample for you to follow. Okay? Question C, how do the plans build? So you can see how this person talked. This is the only part that you may borrow. These plans help students to make connections between the strategy and the skills. These lessons build on one another by how? So in this question, they're asking you to talk about how do your plans help build to help students make connections between the strategy and the related skills. So it's not enough to say that they're going to be able to synthesize. How are you also hitting those related skills throughout your lessons? So you need to be saying in lesson 1 they're going to do this. That's the related skills for this. In lesson 2 they're going to do this. That's the related skills for this. In lesson 3 you can see how it's broken down by lesson. So lesson 1 is described first. Then in lesson 2 they're going to practice applying these skills. So in lesson 1 they learn it. In lesson 2 they practice it. In lesson 3 they apply it on their own. This is where you're describing the gradual release of responsibility. That's how you've all developed your lessons. So paraphrase and describe it in your own words, how you planned that way. And then how are they connecting back to the strategy and the skills throughout all of those lessons? So 2 things going on here. How they build, that's the gradual release of responsibility. You can all use the gradual release of responsibility to scaffold their learning. That's a thing that you're all going to be saying. Paraphrase it so it sounds like your own language. So that's how they build. And then how are they making connections between the strategy and the skills? This is the part where they ask you about the meaningful contexts. You can see this answer, the purposeful application of the strategy in a meaningful context. These lessons are embedded in a broader unit about civil rights and activism, a topic that, I think it's for 5th graders. That's my bad. 5th graders are eager and interested to learn about. This set of lessons helps them to understand how African Americans specifically have fought for equality. This purposeful application will help, in a meaningful context, will help them to understand social studies and how African Americans have fought for equality. This is not a truly meaningful context. A truly meaningful context, as a reminder, is your students coming up with an authentic experience for reading and writing for an authentic audience. That didn't happen here. This person was given a strategy, given a day of the week to teach it, and they taught it according to the plan that they developed. It's not authentic. It's really hard to do that. So that is the response to prompt 1. Let's take a look at the rubric. So at a level 3, which is where everything starts, first of all, there were no content inaccuracies. throughout the lessons, and there was not misalignment. Everything was nicely aligned, so this person does not get an automatic 1. At a level 3, the plans for instruction are logically sequenced. I would say yes, these plans are logically sequenced to facilitate the learning of the strategy. Plans are presented in a sequence in which each lesson builds upon the previous ones. We know that using the gradual release of responsibility model, that was likely to be happening. And then in addition, the sequencing of the plans supports students' learning by connecting conventions or skills to the essential literacy strategy. These connections are explicitly written in the plans or the commentary. I keep getting lost. I got to go to E. I'm going to put these together so I don't get lost anymore. And we could see that that was happening very explicitly throughout here, where the person talked about the standards, the objectives, and strategy, and then down here again with the strategy and the related skills. There's some explicit writing happening around that. And then the candidate will identify a central focus on something related to comprehension. Might be vague about the strategy or skills, distinction in the commentary. Plans have standards, objectives, and learning tasks that support both the strategy and the related skills. That's happening, and that's well explained. So you can see here's the criteria for getting below a 3. Since this person already met all of these in my mind for a level 3, I know I don't need to look below, but let's take a peek above. At a level 4, you will find evidence that the candidate has a clear central focus that's related to those, I'd say sure, is explicit about distinguishing the essential strategy from the related skills, lesson plans, and objectives attend to both. So this is the one that for me would hold people up. You've got to very explicitly and clearly be teaching the strategy and the related skills. And if you bounce back to this person's lesson plans, you'll see that when they're modeling, they're really focusing a lot on synthesizing. The sentence strips are really about synthesizing. First I thought, then now I thought, then I thought, now I thought. The anchor chart is all about synthesizing. I don't see that direct, explicit instruction around the related skills. In fact, I can't even remember them off the top of my head. Everything, the objective, the assessment, everything seems to be aligned to synthesizing. So I'm thinking that if I can't quickly recall the distinguishing features about these two, it's probably at a level 3. And then the candidate is explicit in connecting the strategy with the related skills in every lesson in a meaningful context. Oh, now I remember that meaningful context was an authentic experience. So now I certainly know that this is not at a level 4 because I know there wasn't a meaningful context. So now I know that I don't even have to take a look at that level 5. So I want you to go ahead and score the sample on the rubric here. I would score this, if I was giving this person a score on their edTPA, a 3. And my note would be no meaningful context, unclear distinction between essential literacy strategy and related skills. And that is a comment that I make relatively frequently when I'm scoring edTPAs. Okay, so that is rubric 1 done. Let's move on and take a look at rubric 2. So rubric 2 and 3 are actually based on the exact same prompts and the exact same materials. So I actually score them at the same time. And in fact, I score them in the reverse order. I usually score number 3 first and then number 2, and I'll explain why. So rubric 2 is about planning to support the varied student learning needs. So rubric 2 is asking you to talk about how you have supported the various needs in your class And in this rubric, you have to watch out for IEPs, 504s. If you have them and you don't address them, you will automatically get a 1, which is failing. Remember, anyone in your table from your context for learning must be supported, and support should address the whole class at a level 3 and specific learners to be at a level 4, and then I have some level distinctions that we'll talk about in a moment. So we're going to enter the commentary and take a quick look, prompts 2 and 3, but first let's peek at rubric 3. So rubric 3 is using your knowledge of your students to inform your teaching and your planning. So again, this one has an auto 1 if you blame students for their struggles. So it's going to ask you about your students' prior knowledge, what they know, what they don't know, what they're ready for, and how you know that. If you say things like, my class has 6 English language learners and they don't know how to speak any English, and it's really hard to meet their needs because I don't speak Spanish, that's a deficit perspective. If you say something like, the students in this class all come from low SES backgrounds, they don't have computers at home, so they all struggled to try to find resources online for their research projects. That's a deficit perspective. You're blaming their low SES status on their ability to or not to research. If you say something like, the students, 9 of the 20 students in this class read below grade level, I send home homework and they never do it, their parents don't show up for parent-teacher conferences, I get no help from parents. That's a deficit perspective. So think about the way that you're writing about your students and their backgrounds, and instead focus on the assets that you can find in those students. In this prompt, you're going to explain why you planned your lesson for your specific students. So think specifically about the kiddos in your field placement. Refer to their prior knowledge and or, here's one of those and ors, and guess where that comes in the rubric levels, and or their assets. We're talking about personal, cultural, community assets, and then mention theory and research, and this is how you can distinguish between the different levels. So that's a basic quick look at the rubric. Let's take a look at the commentary and what they're asking. So for question 2 is knowledge to inform your teaching. So this is why I do them backwards, because if you look back, knowledge to inform teaching is rubric 3, but on the commentary paper, it's actually question 2. I have no idea why they're backwards, but they are. My brain needs to keep things in order, so I reverse the rubrics and I keep the commentary in order. So for this one, you are going to describe what you know about your students with respect to the central focus. So describe what you know about your students with respect to their ability to comprehend. That's the central focus that you've all used. Here's that reminder box, like a warning, warning, warning. If you have students with IEPs, English language learners, struggling readers, or readers below grade level, gifted and talented, you have to talk about them here. You must. And if you don't, auto 1. So prompt 2A says prior academic learning and prerequisite skills related to the central focus. This is that question that says cite evidence of what the students know, what they can do, and what they're still learning to do. They literally want you to talk about the evidence that you've collected that they know. And this is explicit quotation evidence from their previous work so that you can prove that you know what they're capable of doing, what they've done, and what they're still learning. Question B, so look for some direct quotations in A. Question B says personal. What are their personal, cultural, and community assets related to the central focus? So what do you know about their everyday experiences, their cultural and language backgrounds and practices, and their interests? So they've put some parameters around this personal, cultural, and community assets to help you. You should talk about all of them. What do you know about your kiddos' personal lives? So think about your field placements. Does everyone go to a community rec center, for example? Does everyone go to the library in their community? That would be a community asset that they have. A personal asset would be talking maybe about their language that they speak at home or their personal interests that they have. Is your whole class like super into I don't know, super into mapping? And so that's why you've decided to do your social studies unit on the geographic features and how it impacted development, and you're going to look at maps. Is your whole class really interested in their own families? And so you developed a third grade unit on families and communities, and that's how you're bringing in their personal interests. So think about, and you can take liberties here and make up these things because you didn't necessarily get that much time with your students, so feel free to make this stuff up. You will absolutely have to make up the details for part A. Cultural. So do your students speak a different language outside of school? Do your students enjoy certain foods? I know some of you are planning third grade lessons around foods around the world. So you better talk about the different cultural foods that you have in your classroom. Do you have students who eat a particular kind of cultural food every day? And could you build that into your knowledge of them as you were thinking about planning your units? So you can take some liberties here, but you should talk about these personal, cultural, and community assets and your students' interests and backgrounds as a way that you were thinking about your planning. So that's question 2. Question 3 is all about supporting your students. And you can see that question 3 is actually planning rubric 2, supporting their varied student learning needs, which drives me bonkers that it's backwards, but it is, so I just grade it backwards. But in this one, you're going to support your justifications for why you planned the way you did, referring to the lesson plans that you've included in your planning unit or learning segment. In addition, you're going to talk about research and theory to support your justification. So part A says, justify, so that means explain your rationale for why you did it. Justify how your understanding of your students' prior academic learning and their personal, cultural, community assets. That should sound familiar because that's what you wrote about here in A, prior learning, and B, personal, cultural, and community assets. So just justify how your understanding of those things that you wrote in A and B in number 2, how those things guided your choice of or adaptation of learning tasks and materials. Be explicit about the connections between the learning tasks and the students' prior academic learning, their assets, and the research and theory. So you will all, this should not be bolded because not all of you are going to talk about schema theory, but you can all have a theory. So you can start by talking about the theory that you're going to use, and then you can see that assets were built in here. Here's another culturally responsive teaching. Here is the social justice framework, which the student worked in because they also learned about that last year. So talk about their prior learning and justify how it was used to plan. And then in question B is a long one. It's the most important one. The entire rubric 2 is based on question B. Describe and justify why your instructional strategies, plan supports are appropriate for the whole class, individuals, and or groups of students. This is one of those and ors, and if you and it, you're going to get more points. Warning, warning, if you have IEPs or 504s, they need to be addressed here, and this should be structured really specifically around those things that you're anding. How are you planning supports for the whole class? That's there. groups of students with specific needs, that's there, and those are the IEPs and the 504s, which you can see are being addressed. And then individuals here. This last question, question C, is describe common developmental approximation or misconceptions with your central focus and how you will address them. So common misconceptions are things that students commonly misunderstand as they're learning this topic. So one thing is like finding key details. Sometimes kids think everything is important and they highlight everything. Developmental approximations are developmentally, so think about your psychology class, developmentally, what is appropriate for fifth graders to do that might not be correct. And so you can see what this person wrote here. We'll go over that in a minute. So think about what developmentally might they get wrong that you would have to potentially address in these lessons. Okay, so I want you to stop right now and read questions 2 and 3. So a lot of reading right now, and then come back and we'll score it. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at the rubrics for questions 2 and 3. And because they're a little bit backwards, I'm actually going to start with rubric 3, which is using knowledge of students to inform their teaching, your teaching and your learning. So they want to know the ways in which the planning for learning that you made and the materials you're selected make content meaningful to your students. They want to see you drawing upon your knowledge of them as well as your knowledge of research and theory. So here's where that deficit thinking can get you an automatic 1. If you say those things that I said before, if you blame your students for their low academic performance, you will get an automatic 1. None of you are going to do that. This rubric has multiple criteria for scoring. Criterion 1 is the justification of plans using your knowledge of your students' prior academic knowledge and or their assets. And then criteria 2 is that you talk about the research and theory. So primary criteria is that you justify your plans based on what you know about your students. That absolutely must happen. And then the secondary criteria is that you mention research. So at a level 3, the candidate explains how the learning tasks are explicitly connected to the student's prior academic knowledge or knowledge of students' assets, personal, cultural, community. Assets include students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds, interests, community or family resources, and personal experiences. And then they refer to research or theory in relation to their plans. Those connections might be superficial. They might just superficially say, there's this theory Vygotsky has of sociocultural learning, and I used it. So that would be a superficial connection, just kind of mentioning it. And a deeper connection would be like that theory really set the foundation, the groundwork for what I planned. I use that theory extensively in my planning. So let's bounce over and take a look at what was written. So this student said that in grade 5, they should have knowledge about government and differences and assumptions held by people across the state. Using this information, students should have some knowledge about slavery and inequalities that African Americans suffered. In a previous unit, and you may make this up in your unit for this class, we read about slave trade, so we've got some prior knowledge here. So definitely talking about this prior academic learning and prerequisite skills. So they have learned about slavery. Regarding the central focus, so this part, inequality and slavery, is actually talking about the social studies content. So what's really important is this next sentence. You must talk about the prior academic learning related to the central focus. Remember, the central focus is comprehension. So regarding comprehension and synthesizing, previously they learned how to summarize and how to make text-to-text, text-to-self, text-to-world connections. All of these are prerequisite skills to synthesize and indicate that the students are ready for more sophisticated strategy. The evidence that I have of this, you may borrow that STEM, comes from the previous units of study. For example, at the end of the summarize unit, they had to write short summaries. Similar assessments in close reading and the text connections showed me that the students had mastered those skills. So that's a general mention of here's their prerequisite skills. I did have students who did not master these, and these are the ones I will modify the instruction for. These students and others are still learning to identify the key details. So what's missing from here is specific quoted examples that the students were able to summarize, close read, and make those text connections. So a really good part A for this would have student quotes and examples. Here's the quote, though, for one student summary paragraph who wrote, "One key detail was that slave ships were often more than 2 levels. This is a key detail because it's pretty interesting." And that shows that the student is able to refer to the text to find information, but he still needs help in knowing what key information is and what's a minor detail, like the one he chose, versus a key detail. So many students are still learning to identify key details effectively, and support will be provided to help them do the things that they had to do in the summarize unit. So you can see this person has connected back to previous units of study, has given some evidence of what the students are still learning to do. I would say the evidence lies here in what they're able to do, not in what they know or what they can do. So this was really focusing on that one student's summarize of not a key detail. Okay, so part B. Students in this class are primarily African American, and they all speak a dialect of English at home as well as at school. Most students enjoy reading, but only if it's something they're interested in. If the reading is not something they find interesting, they might lose focus. So culturally, most of them come from an African American background. The urban school is celebrating Black History Month and is actively involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Each morning announcements are made featuring a strong person and a story of injustice. Students are comfortable talking about race and injustice. The whole school participates in ongoing restorative practice training. So knowing that my students are deeply interested in personally and impacted by race and justice, I chose to design this comprehension unit with this in mind. So this was the foundational core reason that this slavery, African American, injustice, inequality unit was designed. So this is making a strong connection to the students' personal and cultural backgrounds. The lesson teaches them to important reading skills while also helping them to see that what they're reading, that reading was a way for people of color to improve their lives. So this was a strong answer, connecting to their personal and cultural assets. We can really see that some work was done to consider their assets in this planning. So when we look at rubric 3, the candidate explains how the learning tasks are explicitly connected to their prior academic knowledge or the knowledge of students' assets. I would say that this is an and, so I'm going to actually bounce up and take a look at number 4. Oh, we do need to quickly scan for the research and theory, which comes here. So in part 3A, how your understanding of their prior academic learning and personal, cultural, and community assets guided your choice, and then connect to theory. So let's take a look at part A for number 3 as well. Schema theory was used by asking the students what they think the vocabulary words meant before giving them the definition. I was able to form an idea of what information was new to them and what they had already had prior knowledge about. So this is limited pretty much to their quick little vocabulary instruction at the start. Following what they've learned previously about the shift in assumptions about power and authority differing across time and place, I wanted to expand that knowledge of how white Americans had more power. So this is connecting to previous knowledge and cultural knowledge of African American students in this class, tapping into their assets. I chose the Ida B. Wells text because not only did it have a good story, but it was also told from the point of view of African Americans struggling to gain her freedom. It contained themes that they might be familiar with, of equality, fight for freedom. So this was culturally responsive teaching, and social justice framework, which is another theory, which is research. I chose for them to write a paragraph because I wanted them to think about how their perspective has changed as fifth graders. They learn that something, they have a lot of experience writing paragraphs, and many of them will be able to connect to the idea of injustice. So you can see that the students' backgrounds was deeply considered. I would say that the connections to theory are tenuous at best. It's a quick description of why vocabulary was taught, and culturally responsive teaching was considered, but in that true social justice framework, the whole 5-lesson framework was not necessarily followed. It was more of like just a nod to that kind of teaching that happened. Same for culturally responsive. There's a very specific framework that needs to be followed. What we don't see is that like take action part of either one of those theories or research frameworks. So I would say it's a tenuous connection out to theory. So looking back at this, let's take a look at level 4. So above a level 3, the candidate's justification uses not only the student's knowledge of the students as learners and as individuals, but also uses research and theory to inform the planning. So the evidence uses specific examples from their prior learning and the knowledge of students' assets and explains how the plans reflect this knowledge. So I would say that she's got specific examples from where they are at this time, not necessarily their prior academic learning. Like she needed a quote that came from somebody who was showing that they could summarize in order to plan this synthesize unit. Remember that it was how somebody could not identify a key detail, so I would tweak that a little bit. Definitely knowledge of the student's assets is happening. Explicit connections between the learning tasks and the examples provided. So this is where I see this not quite at a level 4. I don't know that there are explicit connections being made between what was planned and those examples that were provided. So the weak point in this response was really those examples. They really want you to cite, quote, provide data, evidence of what your students were able to do. And then the candidate explains how research informed the selection or design of at least one learning task. The connection must be explicit. And I would say the research connection in this response was tenuous. It was mentioned, it was not super strong. So if I were to score this, I would give it a 3. It is lacking evidence from students about their prior knowledge and skills, and then it had a tenuous connection to theory at best. So that would get a 3 from me. Okay, so then rubric 3, sorry, this was rubric 3. This should get moved down because we scored this backwards. So then rubric 2, we're going to back up a little bit. We have now scored rubric 3. Let's take a look at the rest of the response. So here, describe and justify why your strategies or plan supports are appropriate for the whole class, individuals, and or groups. And this must address IEPs and 504s. This is a question that is and or. And so I think the best way to structure it is to literally do whole class, groups, individuals, each in their own paragraphs. And so if you take a close look at the instructional plans and plan supports, this person has planned universal design elements. The lessons are formatted in that gradual release of responsibility. The students practice so modeling happens in lesson 1, guided practice in lesson 2, independent application in lesson 3. This model is shown to be effective. Other whole class supports, there's an anchor chart, which they refer to as a visual reminder whenever they need it. There's a graphic organizer to help them organize their thinking as they comprehend this text. The texts are being read aloud to students who need it in order to take away the cognitive work of decoding, something that the majority of this class does do below grade level, allows them to focus on synthesizing. Be very careful not to plagiarize this. You've got to paraphrase it because most of you are going to have the same whole class universal design supports. So please don't plagiarize. Okay, so that's whole class. That's pretty good. The instructional strategies and plan supports for the groups of students with specific needs, this is where this person needs to talk about the IEPs and the students reading below grade level. Because there are multiple points where content, process, and product are modified for their needs, students with IEPs and those reading below grade level benefit from hearing information aloud multiple times and having additional time to work. The lessons are designed in a way that content is delivered orally as well as in print, because every student will get a copy of the text, so there's one mod. The process is modified for students with IEPs, as they will be able to work in small groups to complete the graphic organizer. It will have some elements already filled in for them with page numbers provided for them to clearly find their place. The product will be modified for students because they'll be able to submit orally or dictate. And remember, from the context for learning, that was a requirement for some of the students in this class. They need to be able to dictate oral or word process their response. So this person has worked that right in. The rubric is also being modified for having fewer and more direct elements. These changes to the content, the process, and the product are a direct result for what is mandated in their IEPs. So this groups of students needs to go back to your context for learning and talk about these students who are grouped as having IEPs, or these students who are grouped as reading below grade level. That's a strong response. And then finally, for individuals, they're being supported because there's several checkpoints for students to show how they're doing. At the end of lesson 1, there's that exit ticket that assesses if they understand synthesizing. I'll check in with them. Students are allowed to work together. There's guided practice. They have the support of a peer, a teacher, or even the whole class if they need it. There's flexible delivery of the content. They get informal feedback. I'm going to meet with groups and pairs to give them feedback. And then finally, in lesson 3, the students will be expected to apply that strategy. By that point, I've checked in with them multiple times with the exit ticket, with the rubric score in lesson 2, and given individual support to those who need it. A checklist of what to write can also be provided to help students turn their graphic organizers into synthesis paragraphs. And we saw that here in the literacy assessments. So there's also this checklist to help any student, individual student who needs it, to support them in their writing. And then part C, so you can see this person has 3 different paragraphs in super fine detail about how accommodations and modifications are being provided at 3 different levels. So the whole group paragraph is about your universal design supports. This one is about your mandated supports. And this one is about how you're going to help those individual students, even the ones who might surprise you that might need your help. So the developmental approximations or the common misconceptions question is here to address key details, the misconceptions around that, going to model finding it, built in the use of a previous strategy, which is using sticky notes. They've all done that to help them summarize, and I'm going to return to that. Common misconception is that if you change your mind, it means that your first idea was wrong, and that idea will prohibit them from being able to synthesize. So I will model in lesson 1 how my perspective has changed, making it a point to help them understand that change is good in this case. And then this says that children around age 10 or 11 sometimes have a hard time adjusting their thinking without feeling guilty or like they were wrong. That is describing that developmental level, that psychology content really specifically. I'll help them understand that changing your mind because you learned something new is a good thing. Okay, so that's the response to question 3. And so when we look at rubric 2, planning to support the varied student learning needs, it says you can get an automatic 1 if you did not talk about the IEPs in that question about the group supports or the students with specific needs. At a level 3, you've explained how planned supports for students address the learning needs of the whole class while assisting them in achieving the learning objectives. Candidate is addressing at least one of the requirements. We saw that. Requirements must be explicitly addressed in the commentary or in the planning artifacts. A list of requirements in the context for learning is not sufficient. You actually have to talk about it. So we can see that the planned supports are definitely meeting this level 3. Let's take a peek at level 4. Above a 3, the plans address specific student needs beyond those required for IEPs by including scaffolding or structured instructional supports that are explicitly selected or developed to help individual students and groups of students with similar needs. We saw this. We saw this in the checklist. We saw this in the plan supports for those individual students and in the universal design. So at a level 4, you explain how the supports tied to the learning objectives are intended to meet specific needs of individual students or groups in addition to the whole class. Your supports should be provided for more than one student. So things like pre-teaching a group of students, providing a word bank, writing pictures, cues or visuals for struggling readers, and then differentiated supports must be in addition to those with an IEP and a 504. So we can see this happening in this response. This student has a range of accommodations and modifications happening, not just for the students with IEPs, but for the whole class and for those individual students. So this was an exceptional response. If I were scoring this response, I would give it a 4. And if you write something similar, you can also achieve a 4. So this I would write has mods for all levels in addition to IEPs and below grade level readers. So this would score a 4 for me. And again, I put it in the wrong place. I haven't talked this much in a very long time. We are getting there, folks. We are getting there. Okay, what we're going to look at next is rubric 4. So rubric 4 is all about language demands. And language demands are focused really on the instruction that you do around helping your students talk about their own learning. So we're not talking about teaching English language learners here. We're not talking about just the vocabulary words that you've all planned to teach. We're talking very specifically about the students' use of academic language. And in Rubric 4, it's identify those language demands. So what are the demands on a student's language? And then how are you supporting them? And your support should be focused on the student's use of language, not their general learning support. So we are not talking about all those amazing differentiated strategies that you just spent prompt 3 writing all about. This is different. This is just their use of language. We have not talked about this yet in this class. So this is a combination of your instruction about language use, academic language use, and also telling you how to do it for the edTPA. The more language support you provide, the higher your score will be. So if you have supports for their use of vocabulary, like you pre-teach, you have a vocabulary little, what was that thing called? I don't have part C open. Bookmark. You have that vocabulary bookmark. You have an anchor chart that displays the essential literacy strategy, which is a new vocabulary. These are all built-in language supports for vocabulary. If you've got language supports for your language function, what the heck is that? We'll talk about that in a minute. And you've got supports for syntax or discourse, you're going to get a higher score than if you had just the vocab. So let's dive in and take a really close look at the language demands. So first, I think it's helpful to look at the concepts, the key concepts here, so we can talk about what all of these things are. So in essence, Rubric 4 is asking you, how does the candidate identify and support language demands associated with a key literacy learning task? So the first thing you have to do is choose one moment, a snapshot in your learning segment where your students are getting to use the language you've taught them. I highly recommend that all of you choose Lesson 2 guided practice. That's where they are actually going to get to talk about the strategy that you've taught them. So then you're going to use these definitions to help you. And these are a little bit confusing, so I'm going to go through them all. The first term is language demands. That's the broad topic that we're talking about here. That's what is challenging for your students. This is the specific ways that academic language is being used by your students as they participate in that task throughout reading, writing, listening, speaking, to demonstrate their disciplinary understanding. So how are they using vocabulary? How are they using the language function you're going to choose? How are they using discourse or syntax, one or the other? That's what you're describing in this whole entire question. The next term that you need to know is language functions. So a language function is the purpose for which language is used. The content and the language focus of the learning task is often represented by the action or the verb within the learning outcome. For most of you, this is going to match up with your essential literacy strategy. So it's often that same verb. Common language functions are identifying main idea, describing characters and plots, explaining, synthesizing, predicting, interpreting. For most of you, the language function that you're going to choose is simply the same verb as your strategy. So you can see this person chose synthesize. The essential literacy strategy is synthesize. There's a handy but somewhat limiting table of language functions built right into the template here. They leave this one purposely blank for you. For most of you, just pick the verb that comes from your essential literacy strategy. So that is all you are writing for part A in this one. So they also ask you in part B to identify a key learning task, that key moment in your segment that provides students with opportunities to practice the language function, so synthesizing, in ways that support the essential literacy strategy. So identify the lesson in which that learning takes place. So you can see this can be really brief. A key learning task, and you can copy this. It's the STEM in which they get to practice is during lesson 2 guided practice. You can all have that same lesson. And then briefly describe what happens. So students have already seen me model synthesizing. They're talking now about what it means to synthesize. They've seen an anchor chart. They watched the teacher use it. During this lesson 2 guided practice, now they get a chance to work in small groups, pairs, whole class, whatever group they get put in, guiding them as they discuss synthesizing and try out this new language with other students. And part of this is going to be me calling on them, asking them to explain their thinking. And as I do, I'm going to encourage the new language they have learned. And this graphic organizer, this anchor chart that is provided in this, has a sentence structure that will allow them to practice the new language function. So I highly recommend that you use the language that's found either in your graphic organizer or in your anchor chart to frame this response so that you can write about how you're helping them to talk about synthesizing by providing the direct language. So here in the anchor chart, it reminds them when you synthesize, your ideas grow and change. At first I was thinking, then I was thinking, now I'm thinking. I introduced this in lesson 1. And in lesson 2, they're going to get to try that on their own. And my graphic organizer is even designed to help them use that language. So as they're working with their peers, they're going to be talking using the language of synthesizing that I taught them. This sentence structure will allow them to practice that new language function. You're welcome to borrow that, synthesize, in a well-supported and low-risk way. They will also be applying the essential literacy strategy as they do that because the function and the strategy are the same. Okay, so first you have to start by explaining what's your language function, when are they using it, and what's that look like. And then in part C, they're going to ask you about additional language demands. So the additional language demands are here: vocabulary, discourse, and or syntax. So vocabulary, all of you have. These are the words and phrases that are used in the discipline that you have to teach them. Your essential literacy strategy should be one of your vocab words. If it's not, go back and revise and make it one of your vocab words. Then, boom, you know that you've got subject-specific vocabulary meanings that you're talking about, and you should distinguish if there's any other way that that term is used or the terms that you're talking about are used. You should talk about that. Subject-specific words should be defined. So all of you are teaching vocabulary. What does that look like? In the sample lesson, we know that that comes in the form of an anchor chart for the strategy word, and then the social studies content appears on this little bookmark that they all get to use. So we have to talk about syntax and discourse. So syntax and discourse are the other two. These are options, and this is a true or. You're not going to have both syntax and discourse. You're going to have one or the other. Most of you, because you chose reading, you're doing reading lessons, not writing, will have discourse. Syntax is for the rules of organizing words and grammar, and that works really well for writing. So you should all choose discourse for your additional language demand. What is discourse? Discourse is how the members of a discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction using the specific structures of written and oral language. What the heck does that mean? It means the way that we all talk. So think about the different spaces that you all negotiate every day. So when you're hanging out with your friends and you're at the dining hall, for example, you talk in a very different way, probably, than you would talk if you were sitting in my Inch 390 class. You will have a different discourse if you go home and talk to your parents. You might have a different discourse if you talk to your grandparents. You might have a whole different discourse if you, for example, go to church or attend some other sort of community function. All these different spaces that we maneuver and negotiate create different or have different forms of talking and discourse. So when your students are learning about your literacy lesson, what kind of discourse are they required to use? So there's a couple of different ways. They have to learn the vocabulary words, and they also have to learn that new strategy term that you just taught them. So what are you doing to help them? One way that the sample is helping the students is to give them those sentence frames for their writing. So the graphic organizer is meant to help them understand the language function of synthesize, but also to help them participate in the discourse of learning this new language function. Okay, and then the last thing is language supports, and this is how you are scaffolding their use of that new language, that new discourse. What are you doing to help support your students in this new kind of language? So this is not, again, your differentiation, modifications or accommodations for your general learners. This is how are you scaffolding their learning of the language. Okay, so if you have English language learners in your class, you better be talking about how you're helping support them in this question. Okay, so go back to the sample. We already looked at the language function. So I want you to stop right now and read the additional language demands, and you'll see that vocabulary and discourse were focused on, and the language supports. And this was a bit longer of an answer. So go ahead and read those and then start back up. Okay, so given the language function synthesize and the learning task of guided practice, because remember you had to name that moment that you're talking about, the students must understand the specific literacy and social studies vocabulary associated with this lesson. The literacy vocabulary that the students will learn is synthesize, and they're going to look at the anchor chart to help remember the definition. The social studies, so this is the discipline specific, are equality, discrimination, segregation, and they're going to have those bookmarks with them. Okay, so that's the vocabulary demands. In Part C, you're just talking about what the demands are. The discourse demands, the way we speak, understanding the language of social studies, including integrating the vocabulary into their discussions in the language of literacy, including the key details and background knowledge to deepen their understanding of text as they synthesize. The students will be taught a very specific discourse pattern from the graphic organizer to help them practice the discourse of synthesizing. They've never done this before. They've never heard the word synthesize, so I'm giving them the sentence frame to be able to do that. What are you doing in your lessons to help your students with the new discourse? I highly recommend sentence frames. You can quickly build them in, even if they're not part of your anchor chart or your graphic organizer. You can go back in lesson 2 and really quickly introduce a sentence frame for them and have a quick 5-minute moment of students will turn and talk and use the new discourse frame that I taught them. You can write that into your lesson right now if you don't have a graphic organizer set up to help you with the discourse. They will be able to consider this new discourse as they discuss with their partners, so they get to do some talking, or in their small groups, how the content of the text has influenced or changed their perspective. So they have a moment to talk. During the group discussion at the end of modeling, they'll engage in a quick discussion about synthesizing. So before I assess them with the exit ticket, they get to do it. And then again, the whole focus of lesson 2. As students engage, they will have opportunities to practice vocabulary and discourse. Okay, so that is my additional language demands. So my demands are the language function of synthesize, the vocabulary, both for ELA and for social studies, and the discourse, which I'm addressing with the sentence frames, the discourse of speaking about synthesizing. So in part D, you read about the language supports. These are the planned instructional supports to help your students understand, develop, and use the language demands, which you already identified. So the planned supports for this set of lessons include structured opportunities to engage in dialogue with their peers in the form of talking about their background knowledge and answering the question posed before the reading and after the reading. The sentence starters are designed to help them write about what they've read and how their perspective had changed. And then during guided reading, students will turn and talk about how their background knowledge helps them to answer the question posed by the teacher. During Think, Pair, Share, they're engaged in a low-stakes opportunity to try out synthesizing. And then after reading, they will answer the question after finding the key details using that sentence frame, which is their new discourse pattern for synthesizing. This structured discussion will help them not only to locate key details and combine those details with their background knowledge, those are the related skills, but also they will receive a sentence starter that will support them in the new language of synthesizing. So all of the materials have been developed to help students understand this new language and to actually use it, apply it, and practice it with their peers. In order to more deeply support the students with IEPs who need additional language supports, because that was in the IEPs, immediate feedback of their new language will be provided and flexible grouping will happen. Okay, so let's take a look at the rubric levels. At a level 3 on rubric 4, the general supports are planned and described, though not in specific detail, for students' application of any 2 or more of the language demands. So there should be supports for the function, for vocabulary, and for either syntax or discourse. So you are literally counting here the language supports, and they must go beyond providing opportunities for students to practice the language demands individually or with other students. You should include things like modeling vocabulary, syntax or discourse, providing an example with little explanation, questions and answers, a whole group discussion. Those are examples of level 3 supports. You might inaccurately call syntax discourse or vice versa, but you're attempting to provide supports for at least 2 of those things. So you've got supports for your function and supports for like vocabulary, and you might attempt to talk about syntax or discourse. So let's go back and take a look. So the planned supports for this are engaging in dialogue with peers. So that's a general whole class support. That would be a level 3 support. They get to talk. Sentence starters help them write about and write about what they've read and how their perspective changed. That's kind of another level 3 general for everybody. During guided practice, they get to turn and talk, answer the questions. During Think, Pair, Share, there's low stakes. So these are all kind of general at a level 3, and we're all really kind of talking about synthesizing here. After reading, they're going to use the sentence frame. So here is a very specific discourse support. So we've got the general function support of synthesizing happening at a whole group level in discussions here. Then we've got discourse supports that are happening with the sentence frames. And then because you're allowed to look back as the scorer on the student's writing, I'm also going to be searching for vocabulary supports because that's the one that's missing. So the function is here in synthesizing. The additional demand of discourse is here in that sentence starter. Oh, here on the anchor chart, we'll remind them the vocabulary words, discrimination, we'll prepare them to discuss. I don't see a lot of really specific supports around vocabulary. So having an anchor chart, reminding them daily, pre-teaching the words, that is a more specific one. So I can see the function, the discourse, and the vocabulary are all being supported. So I would say there are 3. Let's take a look at above a 3. So the supports address the language function, vocabulary, and at least one other. Candidate identifies specific planned language supports and describes how supports address each of the following: vocab, language function. We've got all of those. Supports are focused, provide structures or scaffolding to address specific language demands such as sentence starters. We saw that. Modeling, we saw that, of the function. And then graphic organizers tailored to organizing the text, we also saw that. So I would say that this one is at a level 4. So go ahead and score at a level 4. And I'm going to write supports for function, vocab, and discourse provided. Yay! Okay, so the last rubric, yay, we're almost done. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody, is the assessment rubric. And so to score this one, you first need to go back and review the assessments. So you can see the rubric, the modified rubric, that checklist to support additional supports for whoever needs it, and of course the exit ticket from lesson 1. So the guiding question: how are the formal and informal assessments selected or designed to monitor students' use of the essential literacy strategy to comprehend text and the related skills? So formal and informal assessments, you all have a good working definition of that. Your formal assessment is the way that you are checking in with your students formally kind of at the end of your assessment, and the informal check-ins are happening more frequently. So this is based on prompt 5, and there is an auto 1 if you do not talk about your IEPs and your 504 accommodations here. So let's take a look back here and make sure I hit everything. If you don't provide modifications that are IEPs or 504s, you will get an auto 1. Your assessments must give you direct evidence of related skills and the strategy use over time. That direct evidence piece becomes really important. You need to have direct evidence. So at a level 3, you provide evidence. At a level 4, you have multiple forms of evidence. So let's take a look at the questions. There are 2 questions in question 5, A and B. Refer to the assessments that you have submitted and describe how your planned formal and informal assessments will provide direct evidence that the students can use the essential literacy strategy to comprehend or compose. This is not one where you get more points. You're only talking about comprehend. And your related skills. You do have to and this. So they want to know not only your strategy, but also your related skills throughout the learning segment. How are your students getting opportunities to show what they know frequently? So you've got to break down all 3 of your lessons and talk about formal and informal at every single point in your 3 lessons that you are assessing. That includes quick check-ins, conferences, conversations that you're having, as well as the quizzes and the more formal rubrics that you're giving. In part B, explain how the design or adaptation of your planned assessments allows your students with specific needs to demonstrate your learning. How are you modifying for your students with 504s, IEPs, those who are reading below grade level? So this is all of those product modifications or adaptations. So take a moment and read the response. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this response. So the planned formal and informal assessments provide direct evidence that the students can identify and use key details to add the new information to their previous background knowledge about a text, which is the related skills, as they apply the essential literacy strategy of synthesizing. So how I recommend you structure this is to talk lesson by lesson about your assessment. So on the first day, they are informally assessed by working with a partner to complete a short exit ticket quiz. By informally assessing their understanding after the modeling lesson, I'm able to recognize who needs more support, understanding the skills and strategy I just taught. Any student who needs more support will be shown by the direct evidence of mastery and understanding the essential literacy strategy by earning a score of 75 on the quiz. So you can see they are informally assessed in lesson 1 with an exit ticket. And I also am saying the direct evidence is the score on the quiz. They've got to get 75. They got to get 3 out of 4 correct. And then I also say what I will do for those who don't do that. Those who don't meet that are going to join me at the table. We're going to review the strategy. Okay, these skills all build upon each other, and the quiz provides a quick method to check in with them. The planned formal assessment, and I'm going to talk about it in both lessons 2 and 3 because it's the same, is that teacher-made rubric that's directly aligned to the learning objective. Each of the criteria in the rubric, remember, corresponds to one of the related skills. So describe prior knowledge, describe textual evidence, describe new knowledge. Those are my related skills. And in doing that, they're going to write a synthesis paragraph. So in doing the related skills criteria, they are going to be synthesizing and hitting those related skills. They'll be asked questions. Each of the criteria represents a skill. Students will be asked questions posed by the teacher at the start of each lesson to assess their background knowledge. They'll read a new excerpt. They'll locate key details. They'll use those details to answer the question, seeing how their perspective has changed. They will be required to write a new paragraph, and the scoring rubric will be used to grade their ability to synthesize. The rubric is the direct evidence, and they need to get a 2 in each category. So my direct evidence is the score that I'm giving them on the rubric, and I also talking about mastery. They have to get a 2 in each category. There are 4 categories to the rubric. Each of the first 3 are aligned to a related skill, and they are, and I break down the criteria on the rubric really specifically. I've got that 4th category of writing mechanics. I explain that that's prior knowledge and why it's there. Each is going to be scored from 1 to 3. So this is me breaking down my rubric item by item, criteria by criteria. And that's the formal assessment. And then I talk about what happens to the kiddos who can't meet that 2 out of 3. What do I do if they can't? I'm going to re-meet with them for what I need time, go over the rubric scores, reteach if I have to. This kind of data-driven instruction will give me direct evidence that the students have mastered the skills that I taught. This formal rubric is being used informally in lesson 2 as their small group work, and this low-stakes version of it will help them for lesson 3 as they have to apply it independently. So you can see I go in excruciating detail through each of the informal and formal assessments. And then in part B, the informal short quiz allows me to check in a low stakes way. If they get less than 75, I will use that data to work with them more. The quiz can be altered for students with IEPs by being given orally. So there's nothing else required. I just give it out loud. And that's an appropriate modification for the students with IEPs, as I can see here, orally dictated. The formal scoring rubric will provide me with more detailed information. It will be modified for students with IEPs, and then I explain how it has fewer criteria and the levels are fewer. And then additionally, I've created a checklist for the writing of their paragraph that is for any student who needs that, including my students with IEPs or my students who just are having difficulty writing a synthesis paragraph. And then another modification is those who have trouble physically writing, they can dictate, which was another IEP requirement for my context for learning, immediate corrective feedback, and together these will help me lead to more meaningful assessment of their learning. Okay, so lots of modifications, clearly meeting the IEPs. So at a level 3, the planned assessments provide evidence of students' use of the strategy and skills at various points. That is happening. You can see that the exit ticket checks in with their understanding, and then the formal rubric is used at the end and also in lesson 2. And I'm assessing both the essential strategy and the related skills throughout. That is happening for sure. IEP requirements are being met explicitly. That is happening. Let's check out a level 4. Above a level 4, the array of assessments provides consistent evidence of the essential strategy and related skills. So in lesson 1, I've got that exit ticket. I'm really just checking in on the strategy on that first day. I'm not necessarily looking at the related skills yet. I'm really focused on, do they understand the strategy? Lessons 2 and 3, I do kind of check in on both, but I wouldn't say that it's happening in every single lesson. It's really happening in 2 and 3. Assessment evidence will allow the candidate to determine the student's progress toward developing the essential strategy and the related skills. Once again, I don't think that this is happening in every single lesson. I see it happening in 2 and I see it happening in 3. And I'm not using multiple forms of evidence. I really have a rubric that's being used multiple times. So that's ultimately what keeps this from being a level 4, which is fine to be at a level 3. So this I would have scored at a level 3. My rationale for that is assessment forms are not varied. ELS is assessed. The essential literacy strategy is assessed more than the related skills. So that would score level 3. So all in all, you can see this would score really well on the edTPA. This was an extremely well-written, well-structured edTPA. You need a balance of 2s and 3s in order to pass, and this has a balance of 3s and 4s. So this edTPA would score extremely well on the real edTPA. So your final project in the class is to finish out task 1 of the edTPA by writing the commentary paper. There's a full assignment description that you can find here that's got some other resources linked. The handbook, the rubric progressions document is linked, making good choices, the slides for this class. The templates are all linked. Remember that you only have to do the previously submitted lesson plans. You're not writing lesson 3. Everything is in order for you. You can also link out to the rubric that is being used to grade you. I am going to make every effort to score everyone's projects with this edTPA rubric, thinking about my own scoring as an actual score for the edTPA on a scale from 1 to 5, and then you get a scaled score for just this top. So this is the actual edTPA rubrics for rubrics 1 through 5. And then because a 13 roughly is passing, you're going to get a scaled score on the average of the 5 rubrics. So if you got all 3s, you'll get a 4. If you got all 4s, you would get a 5. 4s are attainable scores, so if you get 4s, you're going to get a 5. So there's an equation being used to scale your scores. You're only getting 5 overall rubric points for that edTPA rubric. Down here is where our Inch 390 rubric is, and you'll see the yellow is modified for our current situation, and it just repeats that lesson 1 is the only one that's required in full. But we would like you to submit your full project outline with this assignment so we could see what your thinking was for those other 2 lessons. So you can see this is broken down just by the task, and then each of the parts that you have to submit has criteria. I'm not going to read all of these levels. You can read them. They are very explicit. And the lesson plans have multiple sections, has 3 sections that you're graded on. Your instructional materials, it's broken down just like the edTPA, but the commentary paper is broken down by prompt, and you'll get specific scores and feedback on each of the questions. And then the total will be out of 65 for the 390 rubric. Then you'll get that scaled score from the edTPA rubrics. Your total possible will be 70, and then it will get changed into a percentage score for your final grade in this class. So we would like you to submit a final project outline. And if you click on this, you'll see that what I want to add, not language function, is I want you to add the language demands. And that's because it makes a really nice quick cover page. Like I said earlier, I get really excited when I open up an edTPA and I see that cover page. So it makes a really nice cover page. Just add in the language demands. It's the only thing that you have to add. And now you know what all of that is. So copy and paste that in yellow into your outline. You don't need to make it yellow. You can change it to regular font. So how you're going to submit this is in your Inch 390 student work folder. You are going to move everything and create these 6 files that we would like you to have. The first one is that final project outline. Clean it up and move it over. Then you're going to have part A, context for learning, part B, there's the name, part C. Everything should be named exactly as it appears on this slide or in the sample. And your folders should be named with your last name, Inch 390 final project. So the sample folder is already organized exactly how yours should look. So make yours look exactly like this. You don't need to have the literacy score summary form. That's an extra thing that I was doing just for this video. So you, in the end, your Inch 390 final project folder should look like this. And make sure you've got everything. This will link you to the sample. Okay, I just talked for like 2.5 hours throwing all this information at you. What questions do you have? If you have questions, post them to this Padlet. I've got it set to alert me when you've got questions. As I said, add them there. So here's what you have to do. If you need that quick and dirty, what do I need to do? Read the edTPA handbook. Read the Understanding Rubric Level Progressions document. Check out the sample in detail. For your final project, you need to revise your context for learning. You need to revise your final project outline. You need to revise lessons 1 and 2 if you wrote it, only 1 if you didn't write lesson 2. And then you need to write your planning commentary. You need to organize everything in your student work folder and have it ready for submission by Friday, April 24th. If there is some reason that you're not going to be able to do this, please reach out to your instructor as early as possible so that we can make accommodations for you. As you might suspect, it took me 2.5 hours to talk through this one edTPA. It takes a very long time to grade these. So Dr. Roland Storm and I are going to need all the time we can get. So please do your very best to have these posted on time and let us know if you will not be on time with yours so that we can plan accordingly. Okay, everyone, my goal for this was to walk you through the edTPA, to help set you up for task 1, to hopefully answer some questions that you have about it, and to make and provide a resource for you that you can come back to when you're working on your real edTPA. Use this information to help you this semester and also in the fall when you are student teaching. Best of luck to you. Please let us know if there are any questions.